Hi, first grade. I have another story for you today. This is called Sideways Stories from Wayside School. And this is actually a collection of several short stories about the things that happen at Sideways School. So I'm just going to share one of the stories with you. But if you like this, um, there's a ton, there's several other stories in this book, and there are also a couple other books in the series about Wayside School. So let's hope you enjoy it. It's funny, they're silly. Okay, so the introduction, you need a little background on Sideways School. It says this book contains 30 stories about the children and teachers at Wayside School. But before we get to them, there is something you ought to know so that you don't get confused. Wayside School was accidentally built sideways. It was supposed to be only one story high with 30 classrooms all in a row. Instead, it is 30 stories high with one classroom on each story. The builder said he was very sorry. The children at Wayside like having a sideways school. They have an extra large playground. The children and teachers described in this book all go to class on the top floor. So there are 30 stories from the 30th story of Wayside School. It has been said that these stories are strange and silly. That is probably true. However, when I told stories about you to the children at Wayside, they thought you were strange and silly. That is probably also true. Okay, so there's all these different stories. So we're just going to take a look at this one, Calvin. Okay, so this is the seventh story, Calvin. Calvin had a big round face. Calvin, said Mrs. Jules, I want you to take this note to Miss Zarves for me. Miss Zarves? Asked Calvin. Yes, Miss Zarves, said Mrs. Jules. You know where she is, don't you? Yes, said Calvin. She's on the 19th story. That's right, Calvin, said Mrs. Jules. Take it to her. Calvin didn't move. Well, what are you waiting for? Asked Mrs. Jules. She's on the 19th story, said Calvin. Yes, we have already established that fact, said Mrs. Jules. The 19th story? Calvin repeated. Yes, Calvin, the 19th story, said Mrs. Jules. Now take it to her before I lose my patience. But Mrs. Jules, said Calvin. Now, Calvin, said Mrs. Jules, unless you would rather go home on the kindergarten bus. Yes, ma'am, said Calvin. Slowly he walked out the door. Ha ha ha, laughed Terence. Take it to the 19th story. Give it to Miss Zarves, hooted Myron. Have fun on the 19th story, called Jason. Calvin stood outside the door to the classroom. He didn't know where to go. As you know, when the builder built Wayside School, he accidentally built it sideways. But he also forgot to build the 19th story. He built the 18th and the 20th, but no 19th. He said he was very sorry. There was also no Miss Zarves. Miss Zarves taught the class on the 19th story. Since there was no 19th story, there was no Miss Zarves. And besides that, as if Calvin didn't have enough problems, there was no note. Mrs. Jules had never given Calvin the note. Boy, this is just great, thought Calvin. Just great. I'm supposed to take a note that I don't have to the teacher who doesn't exist and who teaches on a story that was never built. He didn't know what to do. He walked down to the 18th story, then back up to the 20th, then back down to the 18th, and back up to the 20th. There was no 19th story. There never was a 19th story, and there never will be a 19th story. Calvin walked down to the administration office. He decided to put the note in Miss Zarves' mailbox, but there wasn't one of those either. That didn't bother Calvin too much, however, since he didn't have a note. He looked out the window and saw Lewis, the yard teacher, shooting baskets, like a recess teacher. Lewis will know what to do, he thought. Calvin went outside. Hey, Lewis, Calvin called. Hi, Calvin, said Lewis. He tossed him the basketball. Calvin dribbled up and took a shot. He missed. Lewis tipped it in. Do you want to play a game? Lewis asked. I don't have time, said Calvin. I have to deliver a note to Miss Zarves up on the 19th story. Then what are you doing all the way down here? Lewis asked. There is no 19th story, said Calvin. Then where is Miss Zarves? Asked Lewis. There is no Miss Zarves, said Calvin. Well, what are you going to do with the note? Asked Lewis. There is no note, said Calvin. I understand, said Lewis. That's good, said Calvin, because I sure don't. It's very simple, said Lewis. You are not supposed to take no notes to no teachers. You already haven't done it. Calvin still didn't understand. I'll just have to tell Mrs. Jules that I couldn't deliver the note, he said. That's good, said Lewis. The truth is always best. Besides, I don't think I understand what I said either. Calvin walked back up the 30 flights of stairs to Mrs. Jewell's class. "Thank you very much, Calvin," said Mrs. Jewells. Calvin said, "But Mrs. Jewells interrupted him. "That was a very important note, and I'm glad I was able to count on you." "Yes, but you see," said Calvin, "you delivered the note to Miss Zarves on the 19th story," asked Jason. "How did you do it?" "What do you mean, how did he do it?" asked Mrs. Jewells. "He gave Miss Zarves the note. Some people, Jason, are responsible." "But you see, Mrs. Jewells," said Calvin. "The note was very important," said Mrs. Jewells. "I told Miss Zarves not to meet me for lunch." "Don't worry," said Calvin. "She won't." "Good," said Mrs. Jewells. "I have a coffee can full of Tootsie Roll Pops on my desk. You may help yourself to one for being such a good messenger." "Thanks," said Calvin. "But really, it was nothing." So that was Calvin's story. And then we'll just show you one more. Go to Miss Zarves, and it says, "Miss Zarves." There is no Miss Zarves. There is no 19th story. Sorry. Okay, so that was just a little bit of that book. If you enjoyed that, like I said, there are several other stories in this book, and then there are also a couple other books that are about Wayside School as well. So I hope you enjoyed, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.